Oh, I think we're good to start. Um, we have all the panel members here, so I'll start, and we'll have Anna helping us with approving people who wants to join. So, hi all, and good evening. Thank you, or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you all for joining us today. I'll start by introducing our host organization, which is Lola, the Ladies of Liberty Alliance, which is a network of independent libertarian women leaders who are dedicated to spreading the ideas of individual liberty and a free society. Lola's mission is to educate and empower female leaders within the liberty movement, addressing the known shortage of women in the liberty movement by empowering a network of libertarian women leaders actively engaged in promoting the ideas of liberty through their local Lola social chapters. I'm also very proud to be here today as we're making history just by being here, as this is the first online event organized by our new chapter in Israel, the Jerusalem chapter. So thank you all for joining in making this history. And this event is also a collaboration with the SFL organization in Israel, which is Students for Liberty. So thank you for them also. We're here today to discuss some questions regarding the connection between liberty and Zionism. We have some very interesting guests here today, and I'm personally eager to hear their opinions about Israel, Zionism, liberty, and human rights. I know this is a very controversial subject, so as a Zionist Israeli libertarian myself, I hope to shed some light on the issue and hope that the dear audience here will ask some hard questions so we could all have better understanding and maybe some insights about the Zionist idea and the connection to liberty. One important thing about the structure of this panel before we start. So we'll start with intros of all participants. Then we'll move to the internal discussion, and in the end, we'll leave some time for questions. My job is also to make sure that we'll have enough time for that. So panel members, please bear with me if I cut you short. We have a time frame to stay in. So let me start by introducing myself. My name is Bar Shalev Natan. I'm a mother of two, and another one is soon to come. Zionist Israeli since I remember myself. I became aware to the liberal ideas in my late teenage years and fell in love with it. I strongly believe in the right of every man and woman to have as much freedom to live their lives as they see right, as long as they don't hurt this right of anybody else. And we'll move over to our panel members. Ellie, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ellie Krasne Cohen. As evidenced by my accent, I am American, but I live in France thanks to my French husband. I got interested in free market and limited government ideas in graduate school. Actually, when I started reading things by Irving Kristol, I started reading Commentary Magazine, and that was where I first got introduced and really started to understand how the government is really the only relationship that we enter to by force and we have no choice out of. And therefore, the government can touch every aspect of our lives. And that's kind of how I got interested in ideas of limited government. Professionally, I have a communications firm, Krasne Strategies, where I work with free market advocacy groups and nonprofit legal groups to help them share their ideas about the power of limited government. And I do have a small Substack, A Paris Perspective, and I will ping that in the chat later. And thank you, everyone, for having me on the panel. I'm very excited for this much needed conversation to happen.
I totally agree, and thank you so much for that. Sounds very interesting perspective. Benaya, do you want to continue?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet all of you. My name is Benaya. I'm 28. I'm originally from Israel. I live in DC right now, Washington, DC. I'm working on Capitol Hill as a foreign affairs advisor. I just came back from Gaza few weeks ago after 150 days of service. I'm an officer, armor officer, and I also was the national coordinator for SFL in Israel.
Thank you, Benaya. Eli, moving on.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I too grew up in Israel and today live in London. I moved to the UK to pursue further studies. So I have a degree in economics. And during my degree, I was exposed and became familiar with more free market oriented ideas. And I decided to found my own organization within the university to promote liberalism. But since then, I've been challenging the notion that freedom in itself is enough to live a good life. And I have come to an understanding that you need something that undergirds this freedom in order to teach you how to orient yourself once you are free. And today I work for the Prometheus Foundation, which is a foundation that supports different organizations all across the world that promote philosophy for freedom. So not just the idea of freedom, but the ideas that undergird it. And I teach philosophy with a specialization in the history of philosophy, and I'm very excited to explore how Zionism ties into this.
Fascinating. Thank you all. Real pleasure to have you all here today. It sounds like we do have a lot of different perspectives, so it should be interesting. And we'll start with laying down the foundation for this discussion. So what is Zionism? Who wants to take this?
I'm happy to start.
Sure. Go ahead.
And I think it's the place to start. I mean, Bar, you said that you consider yourself to be a Zionist, and
I'll give my perspective also later on.
Yeah, okay, that'll be interesting because I don't consider myself to be a Zionist, but probably not for the reasons that you might think. I think there is so much confusion over this term that it simply doesn't serve the purpose that I want it to. So if I were to come up to a person that I hadn't met before and I told them, "Hi, I'm Eli, I'm a Zionist," I actually believe they will know less about me, about who I truly am and what my positions actually are, than if I didn't, which is why I refuse to term myself such. I think Zionism is a really complicated term because it is a package of different ideas. Zionism originated as a movement by Theodor Herzl to find a home for the Jewish people. So, Herzl was living at a time where Jews were being not only discriminated, but murdered, raped, and pushed aside by pretty much every nation east of, say, east of Germany. And then after the Dreyfus trial in France, he came to realize that this problem is endemic. And it's not just in the primitive Russians and Eastern European states, but in fact it's in the progressive Western countries too. And that if something isn't done about it, then something like the Holocaust is eventually going to unfold. Of course, he didn't predict that specifically, but it's quite incredible how he kind of foresaw what was going to take place. And as we all know, I think most people on this call would know that it wasn't Israel per se that he had in mind. Herzl was not some religious fanatic, but he was rather secular. And he was doing this he was, by our standards, a liberal. And Zionism for him was basically just finding a place that Jews can self-determine and protect themselves from all of these other forces that are trying to destroy the Jews. And South America was suggested, Uganda was suggested, and eventually it was Palestine. But the idea that Jews have a right to defend themselves and to self-determine is one definition of Zionism. And that's one I can certainly get behind, wholeheartedly. But unfortunately, within Zionism, there's another definition or another perspective, which is that Jews have some sort of holy claim to the land of Israel. And that's one that I can't get behind at all, because this is one you cannot defend unless you accept Judaism. So it's self-refuting. You have to accept Judaism in order to get behind this position. So I think Zionism is a package of many different definitions. And when we're talking about Zionism being productive, unproductive, good, bad, The first
Mhm.
question you have to ask, which is really where we started in this debate, is, well, what is Zionism? What is this beast that we're talking about?
We definitely should start with laying down the basics. Anybody else think something different, or maybe want to respond to that?
Sure. I think in a nutshell, we can agree that Zionism is a 19th century political movement to establish a Jewish nation. What it means, I think, to a lot of people today in the common parlance is that Jews have some sort of rightful claim to the land of Israel. And with that comes, as with all people, self-determination. Something that I think Eli touched on that might not be terribly germane to this conversation, but I think is interesting, is what Zionism has come to mean. And the idea that I think is often put forth that to love Israel or to not be an anti-Semite, you have to be a Zionist. And I would offer that you can believe that Jews have a right to the state of Israel, the right to self-determination, self-defense, but you might not necessarily identify as a Zionist per se, in all the trappings that come with it. I joke with a friend of mine, it's like that old rye bread advertisement. You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's rye bread. Well, you don't have to be a Zionist to believe that Israel has a right to defend itself and the Jewish people have the right to self-determination. So I think that we're touching on something very interesting and really important that has to be put on the table.
Definitely. Naya, what about you? Do you consider yourself a Zionist at all?
100%. It's when on 73 war, Israel.
Sorry, we can't hear you quite right.
Right? You can hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
better.
Yeah, so I said I'm Zionist 100%. And on 73, when Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel, she called to Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State of the United States, and she told him, Henry, we need weapons because we are in a war. And then Henry Kissinger told Golda, you should understand that first I'm Secretary of State, then I'm American, then I'm Jewish, then I'm Zionist. I'm Zionist. And Golda Meir, she told him, like, Henry, you forget that in Hebrew we're reading from right to left. So the first definition of myself is a Zionism, but is as a Zionist. But I will say something about Zionism right now from the political aspect. Before Israel established, like before 48, it was really easy to say what is Zionism. It just, the Jewish people want to go back to them land. Super easy definition. After Israel established, it's really hard to explain what is Zionism. I think Zionism have many aspects. And when we speaking on about like the conflict and about the war and people who like mostly from the left side, as a libertarian, I feel always that I need to like apologize that I'm a Zionist. I need to apologize that I love nationalism, in example. I need to apologize that Jewish people deserve a country. I need to apologize when Jewish people want to come back to the history land of them. And while leftist people or like progressive people, when they speak about movement as a Zionism or nationalism and all of that, they have the rights to criticize that. This is like they can say their position is never danger them. And we can see how Europe look like now. We can see what's gonna happen in the US. Eli can tell you about England, what is going on right now there. So I think the simple Zionism right now is just the rights to Jewish people to have security and flourish on their own land.
This really connects to, obviously, to if I think about it, classic liberal ideas of just having the country as a protective, entity over, as like a main role. But let me just put out something which I think is interesting. I think Eli is also part of maybe addressing what you said about Zionism and Theodore Herzl and the original idea of Zionism. I mean, if you think about it, Zion, right, is a Hebrew name of Jerusalem. So as a Zionist myself, I support the idea of a Jewish state in the Jewish homeland, which is the land of Israel. Historically speaking, the land of Israel includes, the entire land of modern Israel, including Judea and Samaria, plus parts of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt. Now, that doesn't mean that as a Zionist, I aspire to have a Jewish state in all of this land, of course, but that does mean that having a Jewish state anywhere else in the world will not be fulfilling the Zionist dream. So in this term, I think that just the word, of Zionism have to include the, Jerusalem and the land of Israel. And I mean, it's also where the Israeli nation was established. So it's not only a religious aspiration, it's also a national aspiration. But of course, we have the holy places here, and so we won't be able, as I see it, to fulfill our national aspirations anywhere else. But again, as a Zionist.
So can I interject?
Definitely, yeah.
So this really touches upon this package that I'm talking about, because Zionism either means the Jews have a right to self-determine, or it means they have a claim to the land of Israel specifically. And those are completely two different things.
Wait, you're saying it can only be one or the other?
No, it could be both, but it can't be. So it certainly can be both. But if it, for instance, is one or the other, then I don't think it's justified. So it can be both, and I don't think that's justified.
Sorry,
And I think if you want to justify Zionism, the only way to do that is from, say, a liberal framework and not from some sort of religious framework, because by doing it through a religious framework, you're doing it on the premise that someone has to accept Judaism in order to then accept your arguments. For instance, the Jewish God said that we have a claim to the land of Israel. Well, for someone to accept that argument, they have to accept the Jewish God. Who's that going to convince other than the Jews? So I'm saying the Jews have a right to self-determine, but they have a right to self-determine pretty much anywhere. So I'm with Herzl. When he looked in South America, when he looked to Uganda, I think he was correct. Like, there is nothing particularly special in terms of rights that the Jews have, or claims that the Jews have, in the land of Israel. They'd been gone for thousands of years, and if we're classical liberals, we know that property rights, you can't go back 18, 20 generations and say, oh, my great grandfather once sat there, so I claim that tree. Anyway, the point I'm making is that Zionism is certainly a package of many different ideas, and we can even see it on this panel that we have different conceptions of what we mean. And it's true, Zion is a mountain outside of Jerusalem, and if we go by the literal etymological root of this word, then it kind of implies that the movement is that Jews have a claim to the land of Israel. But I'm thinking in the same way that Herzl envisioned, which is that Jews should have a right to self-determine somewhere so they can protect themselves from the anti-Semites in France and Eastern Europe.
Okay. So sorry for despairing before. I had some Wi-Fi issues, but let me just ask, for the sake of the discussion, can we all agree that we'll stick to the narrow definition of Zionism, which is self-determination, of the Jewish people, having a state of their own anywhere, for this matter, without the religious justifications for that?
That was what I meant when I shared my part. I think that's the most constructive definition to provide the framework for our conversation. Okay,
can we all agree on that? Eli, what do you say?
Yes, certainly.
And in this sense only, can we agree that we are Zionists for the discussion? Again, I mean, do you all agree that the Jewish people have the right to a state of their own?
Yeah. I don't think anyone would on this panel would deny that the Jews have a right to self-determine.
Okay. So now that we've established what is Zionism for the sake of this discussion, I'd like to hear from you, let's say, myths that you've heard about Zionism. What were like the weirdest things that you've heard about Zionists, about the Zionist idea, about what is Zionism, things that maybe are a bit more far than the truth.
So I can take that one. I think the biggest one that unfortunately probably all of us have heard a lot of is that Zionism is racism. First of all, that couldn't be further from the truth, because thanks to the diaspora and conversion, there are Jews of every color. There are Asian Jews, there are Indian Jews, there are Black Jews. I don't have to tell you this, there are plenty of Israelis on this call. The other component that I want to address is that when someone says Zionism is racism, it's particularly problematic because if we agree generally that Zionism is about Jewish self-determination, when we say Zionism is racism, we're positing Jew as a race, which for a very, very long time, thankfully, we have kind of disabused people of that notion. Jew is an ethno-religious group, but it's not a race. So I think it's important to talk about that very strange, but unfortunately very commonplace myth.
It's interesting because I try to think about another nation that aspires to self-determination that has been accused of racism for that. And I literally can't. Like, it's, but okay, the Benaya and Ely, have you encountered any other definitions of Zionism?
One day I was in the Committee of Foreign Affairs on the House of Representatives, and one of the squad members, his name is Rashida Tlaib. She's a congresswoman from Michigan. She considers herself as a Palestinian, even she was born in the US. And she came to me and she told me, "Oh, you are the white colonialist here, they're speaking for Israel." And then I told her in Arabic that, I will say that in English, I told her, like, wait, stop. My mom was born in Lebanon. My grandfather came from Syria. My grandpa and my grandma for the other side came from Spain. And before Spain, they probably went in the Middle East. 65% of Jews came from Arab nation. Yeah. We are not like, as them definition, white people. We don't want to go back to Europe. We just fled from the Holocaust in Europe. Most of us are like Middle Eastern. So don't, yeah. And she just left the room because she thought like all the Jewish are like the same typical white people from Europe.
Yeah, so I mean, Zionism isn't white colonialism.
I would say something that Ellie said, that it's really important, and I think Israel are not doing good in this, and I think, Ellie, you can be a really good ambassador for this, that Israel is not showing the world that Judaism have a lot of kind of people. There is Black Jewish, there is Asian Jewish, there is LGBTQ Jewish people, there is like so many types of Jewish people, and in Israel, unfortunately, they are not showing this to the world. They're just showing the one white man, rich man, like all the stereotype about Jews. And I think maybe if someone in Israel will understand that with progressive, we should speak progressive, so they will start to send delegation to Europe and to the US with typicals of Jews, like Black, Asian, LGBTQ, and all of that.
Do you think that we should talk to progressive with progressive? Like, it's real.
This is why we have problem in what people think about Israel in the US, because in Israel, when people think about how to make people to support you, so naturally you're going to the Republican side because you speak the same language. But when you speak with Democrats or with progressive or with people who like against nationalism, you cannot talk to them as you speak to Republican. You need to show them how many climate movement there is in Israel. You need to show them the Pride Parade in Tel Aviv. You need to show them the Ethiopian Jews. You need to show them the Jews who came from Yemen, from Persia, from Iran. This is how we need to talk to them. Not to say it's the same American Israeli Jews.
Okay, interesting point. Ellie, yeah.
I want to push on that a little bit, or hear Benaya's thinking, because when we look at the voting and we look at the polling, so the opinion polls, whether it's in Rasmussen reports, and I do marketing communications and public policy, it actually is that the friends of the Jews tend to be white Christians who tend to vote Republicans. And I do agree that, you could be from any background and just simply agree that the Jewish people have the right to self-determination. But when it comes to the language we use to speak to the right audience and move the base, I just wonder if it is actually effective to speak to people who statistically may not be your ally when you have these massive voting blocks who will continually support funding for Israel. Some of them probably, or I shouldn't say probably, some of them oppose a two-state solution, and they are more Zionists than a lot of the Jewish people I know.
You touched in a really hard, really deep. And I will say like this: Jewish people in the US vote for Democrats for decades. Like
65%, yes.
Yes. It's because most of Jews live in California and New York. Jews in the US voting like the people who surround them. And with these Jews,
that's not true of Orthodox Jews. On down ballot races, Orthodox Jews vote very much in their own interests. They tend to vote Democrat. When it goes to presidential and national, they vote red.
It's true in a small percentage. Like you can see,
Orthodox Jews. That's how it works.
Yeah, but what I want to say with evangelists like Christian, yeah, they like Israel because religious issues. You don't need to talk to them about politics. But when you speak with America, the most conflict that American Jews has right now is from one side they are liberal, and from the other side they want to say we support Israel and we are Zionism. We are Zionists. But if you support BLM, how you cannot support the Palestine movement? It's the same values. So American Jews find themselves in a conflict. They want to stay liberal and they want to love Israel, but nobody gives them the terminology, like nobody gives them the words to say, I can be liberal and I can support Israel at the same time. And it's not contradict each other.
BLM is not a liberal movement, it's a progressive movement. So I do agree that there needs to be liberal language that can speak to them, but I would push back on the idea that BLM's proponents are liberals, because BLM is it does not respect the individual. It prioritizes immutable traits over individual characteristics. It does not necessarily privilege like private property rights. There are a lot of ideological issues in the movement.
I feel like we went a bit off topic here, so I'll stop you here. And I really want to hear Eli's comments about that. Like, in terms of, I mean, we've heard Zionism is racism or Zionism is white colonialism. Have you heard any myths about Zionism that you encountered that you want to share with us?
So I don't really want to share any myths that I've encountered. I don't want to give them platform, but I just want to make a couple of comments about what's been said, because I think Benaya and Ellie both raise a really good point, which is that the majority of people are totally ignorant about Israel, the way it is organized, the people that comprise it. They have no idea what's going on. But I want to push back, because I think that ignorance is entirely willful. Like there is no secret that there are Ethiopians and LGBT and all these things in Israel. Like, it's not a secret that Israel is a diverse culture and multicultural, etc. You just look that up online and you find it. And if people don't know about it and are interested in the conflict, it's because they don't want to know about it. And I don't think going around and talking to these people and saying, well, there actually are Ethiopians in Israel. Oh, actually, Israel is LGBT friendly. That's not going to change anyone's mind. It won't make a difference, because people want to hate Israel for many different reasons. But fundamentally, it's because Israel is a successful country. And this hatred towards Israel from the West didn't really take hold until Israel became the top dog in that region. I mean, in the first few years when Israel was founded, you didn't really hear the same opposition you're hearing against Israel today. But I think after 67, the slight change in the progressive movement, or kind of how it took roots, you started to see how People attack Israel for being strong, for being successful, for being productive, for being prosperous. And you mentioned BLM. Well, there's an extent to which there's a very similar thing here, because you look at statistics and you see that there are certain groups that outperform or are perhaps more successful, have higher salaries or whatever than other groups, and you create an entire movement based not on trying to build up the groups that are underperforming, but on trying to take down the groups that are doing better. And that's exactly what's happening with Israel. So Israel is the top dog, and the progressives in the West and many of the students and the Western individuals who claim to be liberals who are attacking Israel are essentially attacking it because it's good, because it's prosperous, because it's productive.
Do you think it's only because it's good and prosperous and kind of like the top dog, or is it only a modern type of anti-Semitism?
I think it's a combination of many, and I think there are many anti-Semitic interests in people who are motivating these movements, but I don't think the average student who you will encounter at Campus Intifada is necessarily anti-Semitic.
Okay, interesting. Ellie, do you want to comment about that?
I wonder, and I'm grateful that Eli brought this up, and I'd be curious to hear Benaya's response, but when we look at some of these really pernicious ideologies that have kind of a grip, especially on college campuses, they're looking to take down that which they see as successful, as Eli pointed out, but also that which they see as the embodiment of Western culture and Western ideas, which is a lot of classical liberalism. So it's individual rights, freedom, capitalism, unlimited human flourishing, rule of law, private property rights. And I wonder if maybe, to Eli's point, Israel is kind of the embodiment of it. While there is a great amount of thought diversity and a surprising amount of religious diversity in Israel, it is a flourishing Western democracy situated inconveniently for these people in the Middle East. So it makes the perfect the perfect target for their ideology. And the last thing I would say, and this is more of a religious perspective, but it was the Jewish people who gave the world the Hebrew Bible, which would then eventually become part of Christianity. So if you're someone who thinks capitalism is bad, the West is bad, especially Judeo-Christian values are bad, well, there's no bigger demon then than the state of Israel.
It's an interesting perspective. Benaya, do you have any comments?
I'll just add one thing really quick, because I think that's a great point. I think that's probably the top reason why it's even more important, if you're going to be a Zionist and if you're going to try and defend Israel, you have to separate the secular case for Israel from the religious case for Israel. You will not be able to defend Israel using the religious case.
That's interesting. Benaya, I think you think differently.
I would just mention one point. I have a lot of Jews friends in the US in campuses, and I traveled. I was in Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Berkeley, all of them in a speech tour. And when I saw the people who support Israel, and when they shouting like free Gaza from Hamas, or like freedom to the Jewish people, free the hostages, and against them there is a people like the woke movement, or the people who like pro-Palestinian, and they shout free Palestine. It's not the same freedom. There is two kinds of freedom. There is one freedom, positive, like freedom for something, you want to do something to flourish, and there is freedom negative, like freedom from something. And unfortunately, more people attract to the freedom from something negative. It's more cool to go to the street with kafia, that by the way, all of them wearing kafia. But I told them that you never been in the Middle East, I'm sure, because if you have been in the Middle East, nobody wearing kafia in the Middle East. This is the most racist thing to do. If you've ever been in Gaza or Ramallah or West Bank or Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, none of them wearing kafia. It's the most stereotypical thing to think about Arabs. So they are the racist. But I always said, like, there is two definitions of freedom, and while libertarian and Israelis mostly support the freedom for something like a positive freedom, they support the negative freedom. And I think we should always put the line, what is a freedom that we talk about in the liberal classic values?
Interesting point. We touched a bit on anti-Semitism, and I want to take the discussion just to touch a bit about that, because as a Jew living in Israel forever and I've never lived anywhere else, so I've never experienced really anti-Semitism where I live. I can't even imagine what it's like, and I do have at least Eli and Ellie here who lives abroad, and I was wondering if you've ever encountered especially maybe since October 7th, any anti-Semitic events or things, maybe if you ever felt in danger because of your Jewish identity, and maybe Benaya and Eli, because you've lived in Israel and you've also lived abroad. Do you feel indifference in terms of anti-Semitic experiences?
Sure, I'm happy to start.
Okay.
So when I first went to university or in England, I came across, I was warned by my family in Israel that I'm going to come across all this rabid anti-Semitism and it's going to be in my face and people are going to say all kinds of things to me. And the fact of the matter is that it didn't really happen. The extent to which your average person is anti-Semitic is it's quite rare. What I will say, however, is that anti-Semitism itself tends to be a package where people use many different definitions in this thing. And I think a lot of people do tend to make hasty generalizations about Jews. You know, on average, in many countries, Jews are successful. Jews tend to have a rather circular economy within themselves, etc. And that leads to kind of conspiratorial thinking. And I do think there are a lot of students, from my experience, do accept some of these tropes, but they accept them not because they have some sort of anti-Semitic motive, but because like they truly think these things are the case. You know that Jews have a lot of influence in certain places. So I definitely experienced that with my classmates at university. Most recently, what has happened to me is I was supposed to speak at a university in London, and I was supposed to give a talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in light of October 7th. And I received hundreds of death threats and calls to jihad from Muslims, but also non-Muslims alike, with probably over 100 messages that were specifically targeting me because the fact that I was born Jewish, putting aside everything else, the IDF, Israel, and that. So, like, anti-Semitism is certainly a big problem, and it takes time sometimes before you see it manifest towards you.
Wow, I'm sorry that you've experienced that, and I understand. Ellie, maybe you want to take this question because I feel like living both in France and in the US, maybe you have some insights.
Sure. Well, I'll start by sharing. I grew up in a small town in Iowa. So I grew up in like rural Iowa, and I didn't really experience anti-Semitism growing up. And a vast majority, if not all of my neighbors, happened to be white, and many of them happened to be Protestant Christians. I didn't experience much or really any anti-Semitism when I lived in Chicago, Washington, D.C., or New York. When I moved to France, where Jews comprise 37% of all hate crime victims, yet we are 0.1% of the population, following October 7th, there was anti-Semitic graffiti in my neighborhood. Thankfully, I'm safe. My husband's safe. My family's safe. I haven't experienced any threats like Eli experienced or anything like this, but there was anti-Semitic graffiti front and center outside of my apartment. And there has been, I think it's a 300% increase in France in anti-Semitic hate crimes following October 7th. So again, fortunately, I have not been on the receiving end of that, but the numbers that we look at in terms of hate crimes in France are sobering. 2 points I do want to make about that. Number one, Christians comprise, I want to say, like 50% of all hate crime victims in France. And there's a huge issue with churches being demolished and having graffiti. Jews are about 37% of hate crime victims, and Muslims clock in at a paltry like 12% or something like that. So I always say that one hate crime victim is certainly one too many. But when we hear about the rampant Islamophobia in France, unfortunately, the numbers really just don't reflect that narrative.
That's very interesting. You said that you haven't got death threats like Eli did.
I mean, that's a low hurdle to clear, to say I haven't received hundreds of emails from people wanting me to die.
I get that.
You know?
I just want to say, I feel like Eli, you got this, massive attack of hate. I guess not. I mean, not because you're Jewish, but because of your, political kind of work or opinions, and it sounds like you being Jewish was of course part of the messaging that in the threats that you got, but it wasn't like the main reason for that. Am I right?
So no one knew what I did. No one knew what my opinions were, and no one knew what I was going to talk about. They only knew two things: that I'm Jewish Israeli, and that in the past I served in the IDF. Now, based on the messages and death threats that I received, a lot of them attacked me for simply serving in the IDF in the past, and that isn't necessarily anti-Semitic. However, there were enough messages that were very, very clearly anti-Semitic for me to say that it wasn't just an attack on the things that I've done, but it was also an attack on how I was born.
Got it. So it's okay to be Jewish as long as you're not raising your head and saying anything political or showing or saying any opinion at all. It sounds like it. It sounds like as long as like if you are just Jewish people, like a person living your life anywhere in France or in the US or in England, that's fine, and nobody would get, you won't get too many anti-Semitic events or just like experiences. But once you are defined as a political speaker somewhere, or just trying to raise an opinion in the public space, then you'll be targeted.
Well, but that's crazy. It's like
it's crazy.
Fine,
no, I agree. I'm just saying,
but it doesn't matter. I'm saying it doesn't
like...
matter because you can make the case, well, it was only one guy, it was only Dreyfus. But that represents something that's far deeper than just that. Like, they're coming for all of us eventually. The fact that they came for me first because I was going to speak on a campus doesn't mean that all the other Jews are okay.
I understand. Benaya, do you want to comment something?
Yeah, I will say three things. First, I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in DC. You can go on my social media. You can see I went to the Pride Parade in DC with a sign that asking, does anyone know when the Pride Parade will be in Gaza? Just asking question. And I got like over than 1 million tweets and shared on Instagram of people who target on my face, for me, like the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Force, genocider. Like you can see all of that. I don't shame. I post. I love it. I just post all of this. And I will say two things about anti-Semitism now. Since October 7, anti-Semitism changed the face of anti-Semitism. And I will explain. Before October 7, most of anti-Semitism, it was from the right side of the map. Like people who are coming and attacking schools or synagogues or put the Nazi symbols, like violence. And this is something that it's really easy to handle. You just bring more police, more security. Since October 7, anti-Semitism is coming from the left. Is the anti-Semitism that we're facing now in the US is mostly from the left side. And with this, Jewish people don't know how to deal with because we never experienced a lefty anti-Semitism who came from campuses, who came from like the woke movement, from the liberals in example. And the Jewish people find themselves, wait, I'm liberal. I consider myself as a center or like center left or I don't know. And they attacking me from my base, from the university I go into, the university I gave the money to, how I need to face anti-Semitism right now. And I think the whole Jewish diaspora is like asking the question, how we can deal with anti-Semitism who is coming from the left side of the map. Because if you look on the history, all the anti-Semitism was from the right side, like Nazism, like fascism, like I know fascism we can say lefty, but it was violence. It was something like we can consider right. And the third part I want to say that we need to see that as a Jewish people, we're speaking and as like to combat anti-Semitism, but we need also to say against anti-Islamophobia, and we need to say anti-everything and every religion. Because if we will stand only for ourselves as a liberals people, it should be like double loyalty. If I stand for like anti-Semitism, I also stand against people who like hurting Islam or Christian or other ideology. And I think this is the time of Jewish people to say this. This is Judaism. We don't care about only ourselves. We also care about if there is a hate crime against Muslims. We care about it, as we care about people who care about us. And then I think we just a bit forget about it. We focus on only anti-Semitism instead of to say we can do something bigger as a Jewish people and to deserve our place.
I'd like to push back against that. For one, I think the left has been against Israel for a very, very long time. Like I said, since the late 60s. And it's actually, I think, the right that has resurged in terms of its anti-Semitism recently. And and it doesn't really matter whether it's the right or the left today that's worse. But the point is, they all hate the Jews. Like, it doesn't matter where you look, and they all want Israel destroyed. And there's a very small minority that doesn't, and most of that minority bases its support to Israel in some fantasy, some supernatural claim to what have you. And the second point I think is important to make is that I, as a defender of Israel, I'm not going to be a defender of Islam. I'm not going to be a defender of Christianity. I'm not going to be a defender of Hinduism, because by defending Israel, I'm not defending Judaism. I defend Israel as a secular state, and I know it has religious aspects in it, but the fact, and this comes back to the original point that I'm making, I don't think that by supporting Israel, you necessarily have to support it from a religious perspective. I support it from a secular perspective because it's a relatively rights-respecting country where citizens can have more freedoms than pretty much anywhere else in that region. It's a country where you can pretty much flourish to a really great extent, where you can prosper, you can create the future that you want to live in. And that's why I support Israel, as opposed to, say, other countries in that region if it comes one against the other. And I think it's important to clarify that I'm against crimes towards any individual. I don't care if they're religious or irreligious. And if they are religious, I don't care if they're Jewish, Muslim, what have you. But I am against Islam, and I'm against Judaism as such to that same extent. I'm against Christianity. But of course, there are differences, because Judaism is a fairly peaceful religion. It's a fairly prosperous religion. It's a religion that is if we're going to start a spectrum, it's quite close to that area of secular flourishing. Whereas Islam, on the other hand, is not only a very authoritative religion, but it's also a very violent religion. So I definitely disagree with the notion that if we're going to defend Israel, we have to defend Islam. I think that's essentially feeding your own destroyer.
Ellie, I see you agree.
I have to say something, Eli. There is a really interesting case that happened in Italy, because in one place in Italy, the Muslim people became to be majority, and then they asked for the Italy place to take the cross from the wall, because the majority are like Muslims. So they approached to the Supreme Court, and the one who came to defend Italy in this case, it was a Jewish lawyer from New York who never been in Italy. He's not Christian. He don't even know one word in Italian. And people asked him, hey, like, lawyer Cohen, why did you came to protect the cross, to protect Italy? And he said, today it's the cross, tomorrow it's the mezuzah. and that's what I mean. Like today they're gonna hurt like Islam. Tomorrow it will come back to Judaism again.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it more highlights how the Judeo-Christian tradition overlaps to such a great extent, but I think Islam is a different beast.
Yeah, there are 2 points I want to address. The first of which is left-wing anti-Semitism, and I will say I make no excuses for anti-Semitism wherever it originates. There's a scholar named Dr. Ruth Weiss. She wrote an essay in I think 2007 or 2014, I forget, and she talks about right-wing anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism, and Islamic anti-Semitism, and their kind of unique origins and how they manifest. So that is to say, left-wing anti-Semitism has been a problem for quite a while, and there are people who have been talking about it. Another great one to look at is Carolyn Glick or Melanie Phillips. They've been talking about this for a long time. On that note, I think what is unique about anti-Semitism as a hatred is that, like a virus, it mutates to live in its host. And unfortunately, at least in the United States and in France, where I live, the host is a warm and welcoming place for people who ultimately want to destroy the West and everything that the West holds sacred. And Israel is part of that. And so the virus has then mutated to live in Islamic anti-Semitism, which is a huge threat to Jews and the West. The next point I want to make about Islamism, which is distinct from just being a random person who happens to be a Muslim, is that Islamism seeks to subjugate everything that does not flow from Islam. And if you are someone who values freedom, the positive freedom that I think Benaya mentioned, then you have to be against Islamism. We cannot have people arguing for the rebirth of the caliphate. We cannot have people advocating for Sharia law, or people who want to move to a country and not comply with the laws and the values of that country. Now, I do think that people who are Muslim should clearly be able to live freely and flourish and practice their religion. But if they cannot do so in a way that coincides with Western democracy, then we start to have a problem.
So, in this sense, I mean, do you think we should, like, having a Jewish state or having a state for the Jewish people, is this another tool to, oppose these ideas of anti-freedom?
I think it is the manifestation of a positive freedom. And I'm glad that someone raised that, because it is an opportunity for Jewish people to flourish as they have done so. And I don't think it is, Israel exists and Jews live there and the country grows. And our Muslim Arab neighbors have some terrible existence. Those things are not mutually inclusive. But unfortunately, the way things have worked, unfortunately, is that the Palestinians have chosen a government that does not serve them. And we have to be very morally clear about that.
Benaya or Ely, do you want to comment about that?
I will give Ely to reply, but I just want to say I need to go. I'm sorry, like my train is like leaving soon. It was nice to meet all of you. Ely, good to see you again. I think you're like brilliant. And Ellie, it was nice to meet you. Thank you, Bar and Anna, and all the people who listen. And if you want to share any stuff after, you can like email and forward it to us. And looking forward to do more stuff like this.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for your time. Ely, do you want to comment about? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Ellie wholeheartedly. And I think the last point she made was beautiful, because what we really need is moral clarity on this issue, and to know that we have the moral high ground. This is a moral issue and you can't evade that. So I agree with everything that she said.
Okay, interesting. I just want to point out that, I mean, Benaya said before, and Ely, you spoke about, I mean, both of you spoke about the justifications of Israel as a Jewish state, but from either secular or religious point of view. And you kind of, I feel like, talked about the justification of Israel as a, maybe it's an idea that I said, but this is what I got from your points, is that it's like a tool to really defend ourselves from, anti-freedom ideas, or just people trying to impose a different set of values on us. And I think that maybe the most important goal of having the state of Israel as a Jewish homeland is to keep the Jewish people safe, just like in a very basic kind of way. After hundreds and hundreds of years, when we were persecuted all around the world, so finally we have a home in which we can defend ourselves with an army and borders in a democratic state of our own. And I think, in light of like your stories and what you said, the importance of this goal is even more clear. And in this sense, Zionism is actually the fulfillment of classic liberalism, in the most basic way, of just the essence and purpose of the government and the state and the country is to first and foremost protect its people and from outside threats, right? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's it's not just that they're anti-freedom, they're anti-life. It's much more fundamental than just freedom. They want to kill you. Like, that's the only place they'll stop. And yeah, the Israel, to the extent that Israel exists, it should defend itself and do everything it can to keep its citizens safe. Part of that is defending its citizens from external threats, whether it's, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, what have you. Every country should be able to defend itself. Another part of that, in terms of keeping its citizens safe, is also protecting their rights domestically. Israel, like every other country, has crime. People come and want to take your things. People will, at extreme cases, murder, rape, what have, like the country should certainly defend your rights in no matter who comes and tries to violate them, whether it's from outside or from the inside.
I agree. What would you say to people who say that the fulfillment of the Zionist dream, or just like the, the Jewish state, is harming the Palestinian right to self-determination?
Well, I personally would want to know a little bit more about what they mean by Palestinian self-determination. I think the notion of a Palestinian state and whether there is really any rightful claim to that, there are serious arguments to be made that is kind of the greatest PR campaign ever made in the history of the Muslim world, largely led by Yasser Arafat. I think also the unfortunate reality is, is that Israel left Gaza in 2004, 2005. Even some Jews were forcibly removed from their homes by IDF officers. And then what did the Palestinians do? They democratically elected Hamas, and Hamas has been the ruling party of the Gaza Strip for the past 20 years. So they got their little strip of land. They had their elections. And what do? They fly hang gliders over to a music festival and light people on fire. I don't know what else we need to know about this, about our neighbors. And I wish that were not true. I take no joy in saying this. Another example is we look at Lebanon, and Lebanon was once called the Paris of the Middle East. And now it is run by Hezbollah, and you couldn't pay me to go on vacation there. And I don't mean to be flippant as I say these things, but we have to be very clear about what's going on. And when there is a lack of self-determination, or the lack of what seems like a potential for a future, we need to look at the ideological underpinnings of that. And unfortunately, that can be traced to Islamism.
Wow, thank you for that. Eli, do you want to comment? I mean, I know it's a big question. It's like I have a question to answer, briefly. But
Well, it is a loaded question, but it's also quite simple in the sense that Ellie brought out. Like, what do we mean when we say a Palestinian right to self-determination? So at the end of the day, if you define the Zionist dream as the existence of Israel, and you ask me a question, well, is that reconcilable with the Palestinian right to self-determination? But the Palestinian right to self-determination includes in it the destruction of this state, then of course the two are entirely incompatible. You can't, it's one or the other. So if you ask, if we reframe the question as in, well, what if the Palestinians liberalized and were against Hamas and against trying to murder Jews and et cetera, would they then be able, if given they had some land to self-determine? I would say, yeah, that'd be awesome. Maybe we could trade with them, have some sort of all kinds of awesome agreements, and hopefully we could all flourish together. But that's a fantasy. It's just not the case as it is today. So it's just not worth our time trying to hypothesize on what if and what if, because what we have today, and someone made this point earlier, is that the terrorist organizations that seek to and actively call for the murder of Jews are voted in. They don't just come and take over, but they're democratically elected, and every poll that comes out thereafter shows that they have overwhelming support. Now, I'm not going to get into the credibility of these polls because there are many issues in that, but we have to take them as we get them. So I think there's a much deeper issue there, and at the minute or at present, no, there is no way that those two things are reconcilable, and there is no way towards which we can work, at least at this time, for a two-state solution.
I actually just want to point out a quick fact just to support your argument by adding that with the two-state solution and the Palestinian right to self-determination, having the destruction of Israel. I mean, just within this idea, the PLO was established in 1964. So even before the 67 war, where we conquered Judea and Samaria. So this kind of means like the organization to liberate Palestine was way before Judea and Samaria was occupied by Israel. So this kind of indicates, what stands in the base of the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, which is interesting, I believe. And I think that with this note, we don't have much time left. We'll move over to some questions from the audience, if we have some. If not, then I have some other things that I want to ask, but let's give the audience some a chance to ask also. Let's see, do you have any questions?
So I saw there was a question in the chat earlier.
Oh, okay.
Someone asked, if it's not anti-Semitic point of view in colleges, why are they attacking Jewish students? I think that's in reference to my point that most students on these encampments aren't necessarily anti-Semitic. And I think that the point I'm making is not that there aren't anti-Semites there. I'm just saying if you picked a random person out of that encampment, I don't think that they would necessarily be. And I think there are a lot of people who just kind of follow along and have such low self-esteem that if the group says do something, they do it. And that's what it comes down to. There are plenty of anti-Semites there and a lot of anti-Semitic interests in every single encampment. But I just don't think that everyone shares that perspective wholeheartedly.
Interesting. Ellie, do you want to comment also?
I'm inclined to agree. And I don't think this isn't what you're saying, Eli, but ultimately the people who did participate or are participating in the encampments and this, that, and the other thing, they are actively part of a movement and an ideology that is anti-Semitic. So I do think on an individual level, if you went up to a random person and said, do you hate Jews? they'd probably say no. In fact, they might even look at you like you were crazy, but they would say without a shred of irony, no, I hate Zionists and I want nothing more than to destroy the Zionist apartheid regime, and to do so, resistance by any means necessary. And they would mean it.
Wow, okay. If anyone else wanted to ask questions, you can raise your hands and I'll open your mic so you could ask. Oh, okay, just a sec. Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm the president of Lola Israel, and I organized this event because I was thinking a lot about this topic about Zionism, anti-Semitism, and since October 70, my identity as a libertarian become double. I was fighting for freedom, as always, and also now I need to be fighting for, myself as an Israeli and Jewish person. And we need to explain to the world that after the atrocity we had, the 17th October, somehow we need to explain our right to exist. And I was born in the Soviet Union, and my family for decades suffered from anti-Semitism, very awful ways. And of course, they've been to alcohol and stuff like that. And for decades, generation from my family dreamed to do Aliyah, to move to Israel, to fulfill the dream of Israel, just not to suffer anti-Semitism as my parents did, as my grandparents did, and they wish that in Israel I will never face anti-Semitism. And since we moved to Israel when I was 7, I never experienced anti-Semitism. I was like protected in Israel, even though I was discriminated for being, hard of hearing and for being Russian. I'm not from Russian at all, but I always was protected because we all were Jewish. However, 10 years ago, the situation was become different since I joined the global community to Students for Liberty. And I was involved in international community, and years later to Ladies of Liberty. But I started to face with small bites of anti-Semitism from the libertarian community, which I wasn't expecting that from them. But I will give you an example from one of the operations 3 years ago. There was a fellow from Bosnia. She posted a picture, not a picture, a cartoon of Israeli soldier standing in front of mirror, and the other side you can see a Nazi soldier. And that was like a punch in the stomach for all of us. And we realized how painful is anti-Semitism, even without, physical violence. And the reaction of the staff, she deserved her opinion. She had the freedom of speech, and she did that in her personal profile. We tried to explain that this was actually anti-Semitism because all of the fellow coordinators were served in IDF. She actually called us Nazis, and that is anti-Semitism. So that was the first serious time I remember. Ever since October 17, we faced a lot of situations like that. But my question is, I actually have two questions. The first question is for two of you and about you two. And my first question is, if you are anti-Zionist, does that mean you are anti-Semitism? is that coming together? That's my first question. The second question is, it appears that every Jewish in the world, most of them, can see and identify the new modern anti-Semitism, not like, it's not anti-Semitism, it's not like saying, I hate you because you are a Jew, but it's more hidden and very elusive, and it's very small thing, and only Jewish people can see that as a group. It doesn't matter if we are coming from Israel, from Brazil, from France, we are mostly can see, yeah, that was anti-Semitic. But other people who are not Jewish, they say, really? How it could be anti-Semitism? It looks like Jewish people are not similar when they're coming from different countries, from Brazil, from France, but we always understand together when it is anti-Semitism. But other people, even friends, even people who support Israel, and they are definitely not anti-Semitism, they don't understand how it can be anti-Semitism. Why? How that happen? So that's my question.
Big question.
Um, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just saying it is a big question. I just want to point out maybe anti-Semitism doesn't have to be, the experience that you had with the friend posting this cartoon of an Israeli IDF soldier standing in front of a mirror and being a Nazi. I remember being in India a few years ago, and I met this lovely British couple, and we started to talk, and we said that we're from Israel and everything, and we had a very nice and pleasant conversation, and suddenly they said something about, but I mean, Jews control the world, right? And I remember looking at my husband, and I was like, what? And they said, yeah, I mean, you control the media, you control finance, you have all the wealth of the world in your hands. And I remember, I was shocked because this is an anti-Semitic idea. Even if they don't see themselves as anti-Semitic, even if they don't see themselves as someone who hates Jews or something like that, just the idea of Jews controlling the media and the world and the finance and the wealth and everything. This is the base of everything, of all the hate, as I see it, that we're seeing against Jews today. I personally feel like anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. But I don't remember who said it before, which one of you, that people who define themselves as anti-Zionists, if you ask them, they won't say that they hate Jews. And I feel it's only because someone also wrote it in the chat. It's a trend. It's a trend to be anti-Zionist. It's cool, but it's definitely not cool to say that you're anti-Semite, right? These are my thoughts. Anyway, Ellie, do you have anything else you want to add?
Sure. I just want to briefly say something about libertarianism, at least in the United States. So a lot of my friends are libertarians. They work at big libertarian think tanks for publications. I think, unfortunately, like in any ideology, when you kind of go into little pockets of it, you will see where their ideology crosses an intellectually honest line, and it starts to devolve into hate. So with libertarians, I think you could say, I don't think the US should send money to Israel. I think that's too much government spending. I don't like it. I believe in limited government. Okay. You could say, I think Bibi Netanyahu is doing a terrible job. He's a terrible leader. Okay. I might disagree with a couple of those things, but when you start holding Israel or the Jewish people to a different standard than you would hold, say, France, Ukraine, Italy, Mexico, then it is anti-Semitism. And I think that whatever your political affiliation is, your ideology, your belief set, you have a responsibility to hold accountable people in your movement when they start espousing hate. So I'm a little bit more conservative than libertarian, but I share that to say, I think that conservatives need to be way more outspoken about racism, because I have seen, unfortunately online, where people cross a line from saying, absolutely, fatherlessness is an issue in America's Black communities, which is a problem, and that's a true statement. But then they start saying things that are actually racist dog whistles. So when we see that in libertarianism against Jews, we have to say something. And I just wanted to offer that because I'm American and I've kind of worked in that world a little bit, and it might be something others just fortunately have not had to experience firsthand.
Couldn't agree more, actually. But Eli, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. I think October 7th really highlighted so eloquent, well, so emphatically how much libertarians are terrible on foreign policy. They just don't understand foreign policy. They really don't. And I think it's because of what I alluded to earlier. If you're just like, yeah, we want freedom, but why and for what? And what underlies this freedom? Libertarianism just doesn't hold as an entire cohesive worldview. And I do agree with Ellie that, you know, if these libertarians are hateful of any particular people or country and they hold them to a different standard, then clearly there's a problem there. But I don't even think they're doing that, because it's not like they're supporting Ukraine but are against Israel. They're against Ukraine too. So most of these libertarians are against. So these libertarians.
They're equal opportunity with the bad ideas.
Exactly. So that's the point that I wanted to emphasize. Now, I do want to answer your questions, Anna. So your first question was, if you're anti-Zionist, are you necessarily anti-Semitic? Well, I think going back to where we started this conversation in terms of, well, what does it mean to even be a Zionist? So if you're against the notion that the Jews have a right to self-determine and you hold them to a different standard than any other people, yeah, of course you're anti-Semitic. But Zionism is a package. And if your understanding of Zionism is that, you know, there are some Jews that claim to have some sort of right to the Holy Land because that man in the sky that they believe in told them you can have this piece of land and kick everyone else out, and you're against that, well, that doesn't make you anti-Semitic. That makes you anti-irrational. They're just being irrational, these people. And you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So I'm against that. And to that extent, I'm against that too. But Zionism is this package, and to be against all of it is a big mistake. And that's why it's so important that we clarify our terms and pick apart this package.
I love the complexity you bring to the table. I love it.
All right, thank you.
And I think it is a complex, discussion. But I'm pretty sure we've like unwrapped some of it today. I want to ask if there's any other questions from the audience. If no, I do have one more thing I want to ask you to issue. Sorry, go ahead.
Just before that, Anna asked two questions, and I want to address her second question.
Okay.
So Anna also asked about modern anti-Semitism and how it's kind of changed, and it's not as blatant as it used to be, perhaps, but it's maybe under the surface. And, you know, Jews can spot it, but it's difficult for others to see that. And I think there's a similar problem with most or many minorities, where there are certain perhaps cultural ideas that have been accepted, ways of thinking, ways of even speaking, so phrases of speech that we simply use and aren't very aware of, that perhaps they might carry within them some sort of discriminatory, bigoted implication. And maybe we're doing that without even intending to. However, I do think that it tends to be that a lot of minorities, and Jews too, are often hypersensitive. Oh, was he being anti-Semitic because he gave me a bad look? Or, is that anti-Semitism because they served that other table first and we were speaking Hebrew? Like, well, I prefer to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I judge people as good until proven bad and innocent until proven guilty. So I think we need to take, I would advise people to have that framework when approaching any situation.
Okay. We have another question from Andrew. Do you think that the next batch of this generation will latch onto another cause, or will it get even worse for the Jews or Israel?
I would like to take that one. I want to first talk about the thinking list generation. They are thinking precisely what their boomer college professors told them to think. These kids were taught by people who were part of the Weather Underground. They were taught by people who had alliances with the Black Panthers. And I think that there was this idea, at least in America, so I'm speaking from the American perspective, that somehow they would grow out of their radicalism. But instead, they went into jobs in our key institutions, including universities, parts of government. So that's the first thing I want to say is they're thinking what the older generation told them to do. On a more positive note, following October 7th, we have seen, at least from the American perspective, an outpouring of very pro-Israel things, especially from American Jewish liberals. And I make that distinction from the left. And we have seen, for example, Jamal Bowman actually lost his seat. He was a squad member here or in the United States. So there are small signs that people are returning to a little bit of normalcy. And while I don't want to deviate too much from the topic at hand, the last 8 to 10 years in America have been very, very politically heated and tumultuous. And I think people are very exhausted. And I'm optimistic that we are going to see a return to normalcy where people might have heated disagreements, but we are going back to actually talking about true tolerance and what that looks like.
I wish I was as optimistic as you are, but unfortunately, I'm far more pessimistic in this respect. I think it is going to get much worse. I do agree with Ellie that they are thinking, and they're thinking precisely what they've been told to think. And if you look at the origins of the Palestinian liberation movement, who was funding it? Like the greatest supporters of the Palestinian cause was the Soviet Union, the Marxist countries in South America, communist China. So there is a very clear tie between left-wing authoritarian ideology and the Palestinian cause. And when you're young, you're a student, and you're like, yeah, I want equality. Yeah, I want social justice. I want everyone to have the same. Well, if you're going to be accepted into any left-wing movement, you have to buy the entire package. And the package isn't just economics. It's also anti-Israel and anti-this and anti-that. And you have to accept the entire thing, or you simply can't take part in it. You simply cannot be a Marxist today and support Israel. It just doesn't work. And what we're seeing is that, Ellie mentioned tolerance. Well, the left that is notoriously intolerant is also intolerant towards those who won't step up and say something. There are blacklists of famous and influential people who not have chosen to support Israel, but simply haven't said anything. And because they haven't stood up against Israel, even though they support them economically, whether it's socialists or Marxists or what have you, and in every other way, because they haven't specifically attacked Israel, then they are blacklisted and should be blocked, banned, and what have you.
Thank you for that. We don't have much time for more questions, so I just wanna ask you both before we finish. Do you have anything else you wanna add today? Anything you wish you'd said but haven't had the chance?
I'll just add a brief thing, kind of taking it back to classical liberalism and libertarianism. When we look at the Jewish people throughout history, and I think this has kind of informed my worldview and my ideology, when is a time really the government has really worked in our favor? Like, when is a time that has lasted for a very long time? Certainly, thankfully, in the past, 100 years or so, we have Western democracies. I think the United States is a very, very unique situation. And I'm not telling everyone what they have to think or to always mistrust the government, although I think you kind of should. If you are someone who's Jewish and cares about Jewish flourishing, really think about how rule of law is used and how the government can impose its will on education, religious practices, our businesses. And I just wanted to leave people with that little thought assignment.
Okay, thank you for that.
I like that. I'll just add in closing that I think one thing to take away from this conversation is that these terms are often really loaded and people package all kinds of different meanings into them, and they do so intentionally. They do so intentionally to create ambiguity and so that they can attack all of them at the same time. So if you are going to defend Israel, if you're going to try and defend freedom, you need to know exactly what it is that you're talking about when you're having conversations with people, but also for your own clarity of mind. Because even if you ask most Israelis, are you a Zionist? They won't necessarily be able to tell you exactly what they mean by that and which particular definition they have in mind. So clarity is the most important thing that you can have if you're going to defend Israel. And then secondly, I would say, if you want to truly defend Israel, do it on secular grounds, because it is a beautiful country in the sense that it's prosperous, it's relatively free, it's relatively rights respecting, it's productive, etc., etc. We don't need to refer to some being that other people don't accept. That's not going to win any arguments. It never has. And if anything, it's caused more harm than good. So that's what I'll leave you guys with. Thank you very much for hosting me.
I have to admit, it was a pleasure talking to you both, and also with Benaya, who is not here anymore, but was really a pleasure. And I think it is a very, very complex discussion, and these ideas are, very complex. But we did, I believe, started to unwrap it. And maybe we should organize another event. I don't know. But it was a pleasure. And thank you both so much. And have a great rest of the day or night if you're in Israel. Thank you.
Shavua
Thank you
tov,
very
tova
much.
latoa.
Shavua tov. Bye.